I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times. Welcome to the New York Times Close Up. In a moment, we'll turn to the past, which seems more relevant every day. First, with my former Times colleague, James Greenfield. He was one of the editors who decided to publish the Pentagon Papers. He's written an introduction to the new edition of the Pentagon Papers book, published by Skyhorse Books. Then we'll revisit with Robert Ellsberg, who as a 13-year-old helped his father, Daniel Ellsberg, copy page after page of what we now know as the Pentagon Papers. He was the subject of a recent profile in the Times by James Barron. And then we'll revisit with my Times colleague, Richard Sandomir. His latest book, The Pride of the Yankees, Lou Gehrig, Gary Cooper, and the Making of a Classic, is a classic in its own right. My Times colleagues will be back next week with the backstory, and I'll have some final thoughts for the week on Coda. But first, James Greenfield, a former Assistant Secretary of State in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, one of the editors instrumental in getting the Pentagon Papers published. He's now written a foreword to the new edition of the Pentagon Papers, The Secret History of the Vietnam War, which has just been published on Skyhorse Books. It's based on the investigative reporting, of course, by Neil Sheehan, Hedrick Smith, E.W. Kenworthy, and Fox Butterfield from the New York Times. Jimmy, when you saw The Papers, the new movie about the Pentagon Papers and the Washington Post, what was your reaction?
Well, of course, I thought that it gave much too much credit for the entire project to the Washington Post. They were simply latecomers. I wish them well. They published when we were stopped, but they didn't do the fundamental work, nor did they face the fundamental problems we did. They didn't, for example, face the problem that Punch Sulzberger, the owner of the New York Times, faced. He made the real decisions. Not only were we going to publish the papers, the articles, but we were going to publish the documents, and that was a major decision. And we all knew that there was a possibility of going to jail. And as a matter of fact, when I recruited people for the project from the Times, I told them all, you may go to jail if you do this.
Were the papers really stashed under your bed?
Yes.
Wow.
I got them, and actually, we ordered a safe, I remember, and it came and it filled the entire front room of my small apartment. And so we returned the safe and said, well, what do we do with the papers, which were in huge mail bags? There were 7,000 of them, don't forget. And we just put them under the bed, which did probably no good at all. And we eventually got them to the hotel where we were writing and working, suitcase by suitcase.
And it took 3.5 months to vet the papers to make sure they were accurate, something the Washington Post did not have to do once we began publishing. How did we check to know whether they were accurate?
Well, first of all, you're right. We took the assumption that we were not going to assume they were real until we proved it. And we did all kinds of things. First of all, by that time, 21 books had been written by people from the government about the Vietnam War. So we took whatever information was there and checked them against the papers. Then we took several incidents within the paper at random, as if they were small stories, and checked them. And the reason we checked them as small stories, we didn't want to indicate to anybody that we had a lot more. And everything checked out. One of the helpful things, really, strangely enough, was there were about 40 of the documents had my signature on them. So I took that as a good...
When you were in the State Department?
Yes, I took that as a good sign. But we not only that, the papers came to us with not in real order. And so people like Al Siegel and Jerry Gold and others, we took weeks to sort them out, what went with what, dates and incidents and so forth. We were very extremely careful.
Once we know they were valid,
Yes.
how do we decide the threshold for, in effect, violating national, not security necessarily, but printing documents that are still classified, whether they should be or not? How do we reach that decision?
Well, we reached a decision by a lot of conversations about the value of publishing. And we thought this was something Americans ought to know. We were in the midst of a war, and we felt very strongly that it was history we were dealing with. And it didn't bother us. For example, Abe said, are we going to destroy the confidentiality of conversations within the government?
Abe Rosenthal.
Yeah,
the editor.
and so we presented Abe and Punch with the results of these books that had been written by people within the government, and showed them there was no more confidentiality.
Was
Now,
there? I'm sorry. Was there ever any doubt from Abe Rosenthal, from Punch Sulzberger, that we would go ahead and publish?
Well, there was certainly no doubt with Abe and myself. I mean, I was head of the project, and he was my senior. And but I think Punch anguished tremendously.
A former Marine.
Correct, a former Marine, and the thought of publishing in the paper dozens and dozens of top secret, our law firm, Lord Day and Lord.
Our former law firm.
Yeah, our firm quit the day after we briefed them, saying that they couldn't represent us. And as a matter of fact, we later learned, even had an internal discussion about turning us in, which they didn't. But I think Punch, we told Punch two things at the time that we really thought he should publish, that it was important. But if the courts, we told him right at the beginning, if the courts stopped us, we were not civil disobedient. We would not go back to him and say, Punch, the hell with the courts. We said we wouldn't do that. And we also told him that we were aware that it could destroy the paper. We were aware of it. And those are the decisions he had to face. And he had a lot of people saying, do it, don't do it. And Abe and I decided the best thing we could do is ignore the arguments above us and produce the best journalism from these papers that we could, and that by doing that, we would convince them it was important to run this history.
And you did just that. And June 13th, 1971, the Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers. James Greenfield, formerly the New York Times, thank you for joining us. The Pentagon Papers, The Secret History of the Vietnam War, has just been published in a new edition by Skyhorse Publishing, a paperback as well as an ebook. And when we return, my interview with Robert Ellsberg, who as a 13-year-old helped his dad, Daniel Ellsberg, copy the papers that were the beginning of Richard Nixon's downfall. Welcome back. Joining me now, Robert Ellsberg. He's now the editor and publisher of Orbis Books. The quotation of the day in the Times, the other day in the Times was your father saying, "Here, Mary, here are scissors." What were the scissors for?
The scissors were to cut off the words top secret that were stamped on every photocopy that we'd made of the Pentagon Papers.
And you were 13 at the time. How did your father involve you in this Xeroxing project?
It was a small and kind of symbolic participation. He came to see me one afternoon. My parents were divorced and I lived with my mother. And he said that he had a project that he wondered if I would help him with. He had a secret study of the Vietnam War. He wanted to copy it and make it available to Congress. He thought that this would involve some risk, but he described it in terms of Gandhian nonviolence and civil disobedience and truth-telling. and asked if I would be a part of that. And I said, sure, of course. So I really
So
only
you were
went.
old enough and mature enough to be able to make that kind of a decision at that time.
Whether I was mature enough, I don't know, or old enough. I was accustomed to my father probably sharing with me things that were a little bit above my competence. For years he'd talked to me about the war, about counterinsurgency, about guerrilla warfare, and I'd listen to these things. But recently what he talked about mostly was his passionate opposition to the war and the influence of an experience he'd had meeting draft resistors who were going to prison in opposition to the war. And they'd introduced him to a whole new kind of moral framework. The idea that to consider what you could do to end the war if you were willing to go to jail. And that marked a huge leap from a former insider and Defense Department analyst.
You saw the Pentagon Papers, the film. How close does that come to describing what actually happened with Daniel Ellsberg?
Well, that was quite a simplified version. It shows him in Vietnam. It shows him becoming disillusioned with the war. It put more emphasis, I would say, overall the film on the question of lies. It wasn't so much my father was offended by lies. He was offended that lies were being used to cover and justify and enable murder. And that's what he wanted to oppose. And that theme doesn't come through, I don't think, as clearly in the film about his motivations as it might.
We should point out that the Times, of course, broke the story of the Pentagon Papers, not the Washington Post initially, and there's a new book out called The Pentagon Papers by Racehorse Publishing. You can read that from the New York Times. Robert, let me ask you, this is a question I asked the sons of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They said they thought what their parents did was well-intentioned, it was idealistic on their part, but they also felt badly that they were left as orphans. How did you feel about your father taking risks that could have landed him in jail for years?
That's a question no one's ever asked me before. Of course, at the time when we were copying the papers, he had probably more a sense of what the risk was, the weight that it carried to be copying documents that were stamped top secret. I knew other people who were going to jail at that point in opposition to the war. That seemed like a reasonable thing to do at that time. But I really didn't anticipate how big a story it was going to be, the fact that he would face 115 years in prison. And as we saw Watergate unfold and began to learn more about the extreme paranoia and the illegal methods that the Nixon administration was prepared to resort to, I became seriously worried that he might be assassinated or something like that could happen to him.
So was it worth the risk?
Well, how do you measure that? For me personally, everything turned out all right. He didn't go to jail. Nixon left office, the war ended.
You weren't prosecuted?
I was not prosecuted. And I would say overall it turned out to be fantastically more effective than anything he could have imagined at the time. He expected that the outcome of this would be hearings in Congress, not that it would become an international cause célèbre and 28 papers would be involved in publishing them and there'd be a Supreme Court decision and it would bring down the Nixon administration and all of that.
We've seen a lot of whistleblowers since then, most recently WikiLeaks and other situations like that. When does it come the time for an individual to, in effect, take the law into his or her own hands and say, I am going to release some top secret document because I think it's in the public interest, even though my government does not?
Well, I don't think anybody can make that decision for another person. And the fact is, relatively few people have done it on the scale of my father. I mean, examples would be Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden. There are not a lot of examples you can point to. You have to be somebody who feels so strongly about this that they're prepared to accept the consequences of losing their career, possibly losing their freedom, maybe losing their lives. And very few people who've been prepared, in a system to respect secrecy and to serve the government, are prepared to take the kind of risks that soldiers, for instance, are routinely asked to make, and their families, when they serve overseas in military conflict.
Your dad has a new book out, The Doomsday Machine, which warns about the possibilities of nuclear war. Do you worry about that too?
Not the same way that my father has, who has internalized this danger and tried to warn about it for 50 or 60 years. But I certainly grew up with that, and I take it very seriously. And I happen to feel that the best contribution I could make to preventing that was to literally help my father finish his book.
And you did indeed. Thanks to Robert Ellsberg for joining me. You can read the article in nytimes.com. And when we return, my Times colleague, Richard Sandomir, on the pride of the Yankees, Lou Gehrig, Gary Cooper, and the making of a classic. Welcome back to the New York Times Close-Up. Joining us now, my Times colleague, obituary writer par excellence, Richard Sandomir, a longtime sports and sports business writer for the paper. His latest book marries both worlds, The Pride of the Yankees, Lou Gehrig, Gary Cooper, and the Making of a Classic. It's just been published by Hachette Books. It's been 75 years since the movie was released. It continues to resonate for all of us wanting heroes, Yankee fans or not, especially now. And Bob Lipsyte, our journalistic colleague, says when it comes to the confluence of sports, business, and culture, nobody hits and fields like Richard Sandomir. Richard, how do you get interested in doing this book?
Well, I'd always loved the movie Pride of the Yankees, and then I became more and more fascinated by Gary Cooper's delivery of the Luckiest Man speech, where Gehrig, dying of ALS, standing there at July 4th, 1939, saying he's the luckiest man on the face of the earth. And it's a curious thing to say when you're clearly not lucky. There's nothing fortunate about a disease you're going to die from, and he only died 2 years after diagnosis. So Cooper delivered it in a way that makes it resonate further, because the original speech, there's very little of it left from the newsreels. So the only full version of the speech is Cooper's. And then I was reading a biography of Samuel Goldwyn, who produced the movie. And in it, it's clear that he's not a baseball fan. He knows nothing about sports. If you want baseball, go to a game, he said. But his story editor, Niven Bush, was a big baseball fan, and he showed Goldwyn the newsreels. And it's this little back and forth between them, between the non-baseball fan from Poland and the baseball fan, from this New Yorker writer, Niven Bush, who became a story editor and a screenwriter. And he shows it to Goldwyn, and Goldwyn understood emotion. And the newsreel finishes, and he's crying. He says, "Run it again." Run it again. Lights come up. Go get Mulvey, Jim Mulvey, his number 2 guy. Let's make a deal with Eleanor Gehrig. It's the confluence of all those factors, the speech, the performance, and the story, that led me to the Samuel Goldwyn archives, where that's where my book was there.
And Eleanor Gehrig played a role in making the movie, right?
Well, they had to sign her up to do it. I guess they could have done it without her, but why do that? She gave many hours of interviews to Paul Gallico, the first screenwriter, and Gallico is best known years later for writing The Poseidon Adventure. Mm-hmm. He wrote the first draft of the screenplay and the outline, and she would keep peppering Goldwyn with letters saying, "I've read this script, you got this wrong, you got this wrong. You can't have Miller Huggins in a suit in a Yankee office signing Lou Gehrig to a contract." She lost that one. She lost a lot of the battles, but she was vetting it. She understood baseball. She was a White Sox fan when she met Gehrig in Chicago, and she wanted to make sure that sports writers wouldn't look at this film and say, "Hey, you're making a mockery of baseball. You're making a mockery of my husband's life."
She also didn't want Babe Ruth to overshadow Lou Gehrig.
She didn't want Babe Ruth in the movie at all. If given her druthers, she felt that Babe would overshadow Gary Cooper, as Ruth overshadowed Gehrig in real life. Gehrig was a shy, retiring guy. Ruth was the opposite, very much the opposite, a sybarite. You couldn't stop his appetites. It's amazing he had time to play baseball. So she was very reticent. And also Gehrig and Ruth weren't getting along. They hadn't spoken for years by this time. And she didn't want Ruth alone in a scene. She said, "Okay, if we're going to have him, he can't be alone." So she was very reluctant to see him in there.
Richard, speaking of playing baseball, could Gary Cooper play baseball?
He had never learned. Went between ages 8 and 11 or 12. His parents, who had a British background, sent him to England to be schooled as a
Could he play cricket?
gentleman. There's no record of that. He was a horseman, and he could box. He used to box with Hemingway, his good friend, when they were in Idaho together. So Gehrig, Cooper was, he was very concerned that, he'd be found out as a phony. And so he took six weeks of training with Lefty O'Doul, a minor league manager at the time who managed all the DiMaggio boys in San Francisco. And he was a former National League batting champion. He had a great short career. And over 6 weeks, they had to turn Cooper, who was a righty, into a reasonable facsimile of a lefty. And they kind of did. But also, the director, Sam Wood, and the editors were very, very careful not to let any of the seams of Cooper's inability to truly be like Gehrig show. So you rarely saw the ball connect with the bat.
So did he have a double
sound
in the movie? Or?
Well, he had a double for certain things. For certain faraway shots, Babe Herman, the former Brooklyn Dodger first baseman, was there. And if you really look closely at the sequence in the minor leagues, it's a montage of shots where Cooper is supposed to look like he's throwing and batting left-handed. It's Babe Herman. There's a little bit of there's a story that's gone around for years that Cooper was so unable to make the switch to lefty that they flipped the film. If that is at all true, the only thing in the final cut that shows that is a sequence where he's throwing in the minor leagues, and it's very clear that they have flipped it because a Band-Aid on one hand appears in the next scene, in the hand on the next scene.
Now, if we had 6 weeks of training, could we bat as well as Lou Gehrig?
I think the task is to bat as well as Gary Cooper did. But no, we couldn't be like Gehrig because Gehrig was a phenomenal hitter. One of the things that I sense is that Cooper did not have to unlearn any bad habits. So if you say, "Well, I'm a righty, I can't do that," the hardest thing to do probably is to go from throwing righty to throwing lefty. That's very, very hard. But when he's O'Doul said to him, "Hitting left-handed, I'm going to have you look like you're chopping wood." So he put an axe in his hand, and Cooper knew how to do that. So that was sort of like the pathway.
So there's hope for all of us. Richard Sandomir, Pride of the Yankees, Lou Gehrig, and Gary Cooper, a book that is a must for baseball and movie buffs. The Making of a Classic, just been published by Hachette. I'll be back for some final thoughts with Coda. Just in time for Black History Month, John Jay College has performed a valuable public service. The school's professors and graduate students have compiled a searchable digital database of New York slaves and slave owners, including John Jay himself. It's a timely reminder that slavery, much less its legacy, is neither ancient history nor an evil that New Yorkers can self-righteously blame only on the South. The John Jay researchers traced that legacy to 1525. That's when Esteban Gomez, sailing for Portugal, stumbled on the east coast of the Western Hemisphere instead of India. He kidnapped 58 natives, later known as Indians, and took them home to Portugal, where they were enslaved. Slavery of blacks was common under the Dutch in the 17th century. By 1790, when New York was the nation's capital, 17 of the 24 state senators were slaveholders. Finally, in 1799, the New York legislature abolished slavery, effective nearly 3 decades later. Even then, fugitive slaves seeking sanctuary in New York could be kidnapped by their owners. A New York court could also order them returned to the South. Presiding as district attorney was a former slave owner, Richard Riker, just another reason to shutter the jails on Rikers Island. Slave ships could still anchor in New York and be resupplied, and many of those ships were owned or financed by New Yorkers, with prominent names like Delancey, Livingston, Rutgers, and Jay. John Jay, after whom the college is named, was governor of New York. He was first Chief Justice of the United States. He was also a slaveholder himself. He owned at least 17. His father and grandfather had invested in the slave trade earlier in the 18th century. But as far back as 1777, when the state constitution was drafted, Jay advocated the abolition of slavery. In 1785, he founded the New York Manumission Society as an abolitionist. As governor in 1799, he signed the Gradual Abolition Law. So what is Jay's legacy? In sum, college officials concluded, quote, with respect to the law and practice of slavery, we have to recognize that he was a slaveholder in both word and deed. However, the ferocity of advocacy for justice should also be measured by lasting accomplishment. No less an opponent of slavery than Horace Greeley, the publisher of the New York Tribune, later put it this way: to Chief Justice Jay may be attributed, more than any other man, the abolition of bondage in this state. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.